My name is Karen Amendola, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at the Police Foundation, which is a nonprofit national organization dedicated to improving policing in America. I, by training, am an industrial and organizational psychologist, and I have focused on police issues for the last 20 years. Shift length is a very important consideration in police agencies today. The main reason is that there's been a trend away from the traditional 8-hour schedules. In fact, we did a survey in 2005 and again in 2009 with 300 law enforcement agencies nationwide. It was a randomly selected sample, and we found that over the past 4 years, the trend is away from 8-hour shifts to other types of shifts, including 10-hour, 12-hour, and even combinations of 8, 10, and 12-hour shift, as well as things like 11 and 13-hour shifts. All of that research has indicated to me that there's a scrambling about going around the field to determine what practices are really the most effective and most efficient. Findings from studies in other industries as well as policing have related to outcomes such as job satisfaction, motivation, work-family conflict, how this impacts people in their home lives. It's also examined other types of outcomes such as performance, safety, and fatigue. Those findings have by and large suggested that officers and actually workers in any industry tend to like compressed schedules. They enjoy working less days but longer hours. But the findings related to performance have been mixed. Some have found reductions in the amount of sick usage. Others have found increases in sick usage. Some have found reductions in performance or safety, but generally those studies have used the indicators of performance which are subjective. So they would be supervisory ratings of performance, and many times they'll say they've performed better based on what a supervisor has said, but not necessarily based on any objective measure of performance. In American policing, there's been a renewed interest in the schedules that officers work because many have conjectured in the past, both police leaders and the officers themselves, that there can be many improvements in efficiency or effectiveness in their agencies by using a compressed schedule. Unfortunately, not a lot of research has been conducted that would support those beliefs or anecdotes that have been suggested by unions, by police officials, and even by scientists. And so the research that we've conducted is designed to really examine the objective outputs: performance, sick leave, injuries, accidents, fatigue, health, and a variety of other measures, so that we can help to determine whether or not there really are efficiency or effectiveness improvements. The Police Foundation study was designed to test the effects of 8, 10, and 12-hour shifts. So in order to do that, we worked with 2 agencies, Arlington, Texas, and Detroit, Michigan, and randomly assigned officers in those agencies to each of those shifts. And in doing that, we also wanted to take into consideration that there's times of day at which people work where, in fact, their performance could be more affected than other times. And so our design was a randomized block design where we used the site in case there were site differences, meaning Arlington and Detroit may have different ways in which these shifts affect their officers, and then also to test the effect of time of day of the shift. So that in a randomized block design, we're able to eliminate the independent effects of the site itself operating on these performance outcomes, as well as the time of day at which officers are working, so that we could independently assess simply the length of the shift in determining various outcomes. At the outset of the study, we collected baseline measures across a variety of outcome categories. These included health, safety, performance, and quality of life, as well as amount of sleep officers received, the amount of stress that they had, and other personal measures of life satisfaction. During the 6 months of the study, we were then able to monitor these same measures and look at the extent to which the shift length had an impact on the outcomes. The results of the study indicated that indeed shift length matters. In fact, those working 10-hour shifts had advantages over those working 8-hour shifts. And some of those advantages indeed did not inure to those on 12-hour shifts. For example, those on 10-hour shifts got on average a half hour more sleep per 24-hour period. Now you can imagine that over the course of a year, this is getting close to 200 hours of additional sleep. The increased sleep can certainly reduce the amount of fatigue that officers feel and ultimately prevent accidents and prevent safety problems, as well as reduce the costs associated with sickness and injuries. So there's a cost factor associated with the change to a different kind of shift configuration. Similarly, officers working 10-hour shifts worked significantly less overtime, such that those working 8-hour shifts worked 5 times the amount of overtime hours than did those working 10-hour shifts. This effect was in fact also true for those working 12-hour shifts, although the effect was somewhat smaller. If you had worked an 8-hour shift, you were working 3 times the amount of overtime as somebody who had worked a 12-hour shift. But the benefit of sleep didn't extend to the 12-hour shift. And in fact, officers on 12-hour shifts felt more fatigued, although this was not objectively measured in terms of their performance, but subjectively they reported feeling more fatigued. This is important because subjective fatigue does matter. In fact, scientists have asserted in the past, with support, that people tend to underestimate the level of fatigue that they're experiencing. And it's my belief that because of the culture of policing, that officers are less inclined to report that they're fatigued, as would be the case in medicine, for example. So the costs associated with these shifts could be reduced, certainly for either type of compressed schedule, but the fact that 12-hour shifts lead people to feeling more fatigued could in fact be a cost too great to bear. So in essence, we have some benefits of 10-hour shifts, and an additional benefit besides the lessened overtime, besides the fact that officers get more sleep, is that they tend to have a greater quality of life. Now, you may question, why does quality of life matter? And I would say, as an organizational psychologist, that it matters not a substantial amount, because the connection between satisfaction on the job and performance has not been strongly established. However, we do know that people that are more satisfied with their jobs do tend to reduce their amount of absenteeism. They don't call in sick as often. They don't withdraw from the job as much. So these kinds of effects, while not substantial, are certainly meaningful. And of course, you would hope that you'd have satisfied workers for the sake of satisfaction in and of itself. So we see these benefits from the 10-hour shifts, and we see some minor benefits to the 12-hour shift, but in the 12-hour shift, simply the risks associated with being more fatigued, even if it's just a subjective feeling of fatigue, is probably not worth the cost of employing a 12-hour shift, because the risk could be greater. And in fact, we did find that for those working 12-hour shifts, they were less alert at work, and they reported this on an hourly basis. So it seems that working a 12-hour shift results in not only feeling more fatigued, but in feeling less alert on the job. And we all know that alertness is associated with the ability to carry out general kinds of functions. Certainly in policing, these would be communications with the public. These would be things like being able to perform at optimal capacity in situations that are critical. For example, a shooting incident, a driving incident in which they have to make significant maneuvers. All of these types of things could be impacted by the level of alertness that an officer feels. In addition, findings in other industries have suggested that long days of work, meaning 12 hours or more, especially when combined with more than 48 hours of work in a week, can be significantly detrimental in terms of accident risk. So if agencies are interested in looking at compressing a schedule into a 12-hour shift, for example, 3 12-hour shifts in a week, they have to be particularly concerned with performance not only on the job toward the end of the shift, but also as the officer leaves the job, because many accidents in policing occur while officers are returning from their tours of duty. The findings of our research raise some new questions for police leaders. First and foremost, if you are to adopt a 10-hour shift, how do you go about implementing such a schedule? And will there be other costs, besides the cost savings you might benefit from, will there be other costs that you'll have to incur in order to implement those shifts? For example, will you need more vehicles if you have more people working but longer days and fewer days? The question is not one that has been adequately addressed in the scientific literature. However, we at the Police Foundation are working with an agency currently to look at the various advantages and disadvantages of different types of 10-hour shifts and various configurations of what days they would not work, as well as the implications associated with costs, resource needs, and the like. Certainly, there's advantages of 8 and 10-hour shifts in the eyes of a police leader. However, the science has not firmly established what all of the parameters are that should be looked at in implementing different types of shift schedules. Needless to say, there's been well-established research over the years across industries on the negative impacts of rotating shifts. In fact, in our national survey, we found that from 2005 until 2009, there was a reduction in the number of agencies using rotating shifts from almost 50% down to 25%. This to me signifies that agencies are beginning to use the evidence that's out there in ways that can adequately affect the implementation of policies and practices that will be most efficient and most effective. However, not much has been known about the lengths of shifts. With these findings, agencies can begin to test out different schedules that will be best workable within their agencies. We did find in our study that there were no advantages to 8-hour shifts, in fact. Therefore, I think we'll continue to see movement away from 8-hour shifts, regardless of the size of the agency. The question is, what is the optimal shift schedule? And I think our study has provided some guidance in being able to address that, but also it's very important that individuals understand that when you're managing a police organization, there are many other factors that need to be considered in deciding on which shift is best to implement. And so going strictly on the findings of this research may not sufficiently address the kinds of needs that an agency has or the other types of considerations that they have. Certainly with a small agency, you may not have enough officers to cover all 7 days of the week if your officers are indeed only going to work 4 days during the week instead of 5. So these are considerations that have to be made at the local level, but guided by research such as this that would help to delineate the problems or the potential difficulties, as well as some key significant advantages. And in these cases, many of the advantages seem to be economic as well as safety related, and those simply should not be overlooked. So we hope that this study provides the guidance that's needed by policymakers today in order to make the right decisions for their organizations.